Husbands, if your wife cannot stand on her own two legs, don't catch her, let her fall. Wives, if your husband cannot stand on his own two legs, don't catch him, let him fall. LGBTQ2 plus community. If your significant other cannot stand on their own two legs, don't catch him, let him fall. This is probably the best advice I can give to married couples about marriage. Is that what marriage is? And the true thing, what biblical marriage is, how to define biblical marriage in the Bible. Hi, my name is Michael Wireman. I'm going to share with you more mind-blowing teachings and doctrines from the Bible, which you may have missed or overlooked. First of all, we need to understand what biblical marriage is. I'll tell you what, marriage is not a sacrament. I repeat, marriage is not a sacrament. Marriage is not a covenant. I also repeat that. Marriage is not a covenant. What marriage is a non-binding contract between two or more individuals, regardless of race, gender, or sex. Age is a questionable issue, but good back then for obvious reasons. And of course, adultery is either a breach, violation, or termination of the contract of marriage. And a divorce is a termination of the contract of marriage. The earliest sign of marriage in the Bible is the second book of Genesis. And we have the story of God removing Adam's rib and creating Eve through Adam's rib, through removing Adam's rib. That is clearly meant to be poetic, fictional poetry, and should not be taken seriously. It was probably the earliest attempt at erotic fiction. When Adam said, "This one is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I call her woman because it was taken from man." Don't take it seriously. The only part of Genesis 2 you should take seriously about marriage is that this is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. So the two of them become one body. And the man and his wife were both naked and they felt no shame. Genesis 2, 24 through 25. That's all you need to know about marriage in Genesis 2, 24 to 25. One body, one flesh, but basically, when he says it becomes one flesh or one body, that's metaphorical. When Jesus in the sermon stated, "If your eye causes you to sin, you should pluck it out," this does not mean that we should take an ice pick and gouge out our own eyes. This means that whatever is distracting us, we should look away from it. Always better to pay attention to the road ahead of you and look at the traffic around you, rather than to crash into the car in front of you while you are glaring at this billboard. And of course, one of the 10 Commandments, found in Exodus 20:14, "You shall not commit adultery," and Deuteronomy 5:18, "You shall not commit adultery." And of course there's Leviticus 20, verse 10. If anyone commits adultery, with their neighbor's wife, then both the adulterer and the adulteress must be put to death. So, Exodus 20:14 and Deuteronomy 5:18 states that you should not commit adultery. And of course, Leviticus 20:10 states that whoever commits adultery is punishable by death. Of course, book of Deuteronomy also has an alternative to marriage. Right here in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 through 3. After a man marries a woman, gets married, and having relationships with his wife, and is later displeased with her for some reason, then the two of them can write out papers of divorce, which they both sign and go their separate ways. After leaving their husband, she may go and marry a second husband. She may go and marry a second. If the second husband too comes to dislike her for some reason, then she too can write out papers of divorce, they both sign and go their separate ways. Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 through 3. The gist of Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 3 is that couples can divorce and remarry, divorce or remarry. It makes sense though, 50% of all marriages do end in divorce. That was until Jesus came on the earth. Are you ready? Let's see what Jesus has to say about it in the Gospels. We'll start with Matthew chapter 5, 31 to 32. It says, "Whoever divorces their wife must write their papers of divorce. But I say unto you, whoever divorces their wife, except the marriage is unlawful, causes her to commit adultery. Whoever marries a divorced person commits adultery." This is also repeated in Matthew 19, 3 through 9. Some Pharisees came to him, testing him, asking, "Is it lawful for couples to divorce for any reason?" He said to them in reply, "Have you not read that in the beginning, when God created man and male and female, God created man, made the male and female, and said, 'For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and join with his wife, and the two of them shall become one flesh. And so they are no longer two, but one. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate.'" Then they asked him, "Then why did Moses allow men to write out papers of divorce, which they both sign and go their separate ways?" He said, "Because," then Jesus replied, "because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses permitted you to divorce your spouses. But it was not what God originally intended. And I say unto you, whoever divorces their spouse, such as the marriage is unlawful, and marries another woman, commits adultery." Matthew 19, 3 through 9. Now let's go to Mark 10, 2 through 12. And it says, "Some Pharisees came to him, asking, 'Is it lawful for couples to divorce?' They were testing him. Jesus then replied to them, 'What did Moses say about divorce?' They said, 'Moses permitted couples to write out papers of divorce. They both sign and go their separate ways.' Jesus said to them, 'Because of the hardness of your hearts, Moses wrote you this commandment. But from the very beginning, when God created human beings, he made them male and female. And for this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father and join with his wife, so that they are no longer two, but one. And what God has joined together, let no one separate.' Later, when he was in the house with his disciples, they brought up the subject again. And Jesus replied, 'Whoever divorces their spouse and marries someone else commits adultery against them. If whoever marries a divorced person, they too commit adultery.'" And then we also have Luke 16:18. I like this because Luke has combined like all of Matthew 5, 31 to 32, Matthew 19, 3 through 9, and Mark 10, 2 through 12 into a single verse. So, Luke 16:18 says, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. Whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery." So, according to Matthew 5, 31 to 32, Matthew 19, 3 through 9, Mark 10, 2 through 12, and Luke 16:18, Jesus overturned and nullified the divorce clause in Deuteronomy 24. Or did he? Basically, he did not say that, Jesus says, whoever divorces their spouse marries another commits adultery. He did not say that, divorce should not be allowed, it should be condemned. Whoever divorces and remarries should be condemned to death. Keep in mind, this is only Matthew, Mark's, and Luke's gospel. And believe it or not, the Old Testament Bible does condone adultery on certain occasions. Of course, Deuteronomy 24, verse 1 through 3, is an acceptable form of adultery. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, we have the story of David and Bathsheba. In the first five verses, we learn that King David sees Bathsheba, and Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah the Hittite. Under certain circumstances, he invites Bathsheba into his house, they have a sexual affair together, and it was consensual. Was a form of consensual adultery. I mean, Bathsheba was not forced against her will. There were messengers. They weren't soldiers who took her against her will. They were messengers. And she came to David at her own will and had affair with him, and had sex with David, and eventually conceived future King Solomon. And God was all right with that. It was only after King David arranged the death of Uriah and married Bathsheba when he went too far and God disciplined him. And now let's go to John's Gospel. In John, remember, because believe it or not, in John's Gospel, Jesus has encounters with two adulterous women. Not just one, but two. Remember the Samaritan woman at the well who Jesus talked to? She was an adulteress. In fact, Jesus actually calls her out as an adulteress. Go up here. Let's have it. Here we go. 14, all right. John chapter 14, 16 through 18. Then Jesus said to her, "Go, get your husband and bring him back here." The woman said to her and answered, "I do not have a husband." Jesus answered her, "You are right in saying that I do not have a husband. For you've had 5 husbands, and the man you're staying with now is not your husband. So what you said was true." Wow. In this brief passage, John chapter 4, 16 and 18, Jesus called the woman out as adulteress. She was divorced 4 times. She was married 4 times. Her current husband's away on a business trip. Now she's seen someone behind her husband's back. He does not condemn her. He doesn't say, "You're going to be stoned for your adultery," and everything else. No, he didn't. He rewarded him. He said, "What you said was true." Right in saying that. He was congratulating her. He was rewarding her. And, of course, we have the all too famous story from John chapter 8, 3 to 11. Now, remember, most modern Bibles would say John chapter 8, 3 to 11 is simply, how should we say this, wasn't original, it was added later. Just ignore it. It was created so that Winnie the Pooh's evil brother could alter it and have his way with it. In John chapter 8, 3 to 11, it says, quote, "Then the scribes and Pharisees brought him a woman that had been caught in the act of committing adultery and made her stand in their midst. They said to him, 'Teacher, this woman was caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now, according to the law of Moses, such a woman should be stoned to death. What do you say?' They were, of course, testing him, that they may have something to accuse him of. But Jesus stooped down low, and with his finger he wrote in the ground. He wrote, 'Adultery is not a big deal.' When they continued asking him, he stood up straight and asked them, 'Whoever among you is without sin, let them stone her to death.' Then he bent down low, he wrote in the ground again. At this response, they went away one by one, beginning with the elders, until he was left alone with the woman before him. Then Jesus stood up straight and said, 'Woman, where are your accusers? Has no one condemned you?' The woman said, 'No one, my Lord.' He says, 'Neither do I. Go and sin no more.'" So you see, under certain circumstances, adultery is consensual. Adultery is permissible if it's consensual. Like a divorce, or even if your husband's away on a trip, probably if your husband's away without your husband's marriage, you can probably have adultery with them. So just remember, and of course, if anything, according to John chapter 8, 3 through 11, Jesus more likely abolished Exodus 20:14, Deuteronomy 5:18, and Leviticus 20:10, rather than, if anything, the 4 Gospels, Jesus is more against than he is against Deuteronomy 24, the divorce clause of Deuteronomy 24. And that is what I think about adultery. God bless you, and have a wonderful day.